Okay, and we are live on Facebook. It's my great privilege and honor today to have Mr. John Tamny join me. John, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, JR, very much.
And of course, Mr. Tamny is the editor of Real Clear Markets, vice president at Freedom Works, and a senior economic advisor to Applied Finance Advisors. We're going to be providing links to these websites. And his new book is entitled When Politicians Panicked, the New Coronavirus Expert Opinion and a Tragic Lapse of Reason. And there is the book. All you needed to do, John, was to squeeze a picture of Phil Murphy in there as well. And we're going to be discussing that. But we also see these other personalities on there who are indicative of how politicians indeed panicked with the COVID 19 lockdown, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And John, I just want to say that I consider you one of the foremost and best journalists writing about markets and writing about economic journalism. So anyone out there who's not heard of Mr. Tamny or read any of his work, they need to do so. And of course, we'll be providing links as we conclude this conversation. But John, let's get started with what I thought was a very profound remark that you made on page 92 of the book. And that is that, quote, "This once again is not a medical book. It's instead one that aims to tell an economic story that was a consequence of panic by politicians," unquote.
That's it. Let's never forget that the virus had been spreading for months. It had been in the news for months. People, let's be clear, people are the marketplace. They had been responding for months. When you think about it, I document in the books, and this came from the New York Times. This was known information. The red states, the science denying states, precisely because they had locked down last, their people had begun to adjust the soonest to the arrival of a virus that people were uncertain about. Perfectly understandable. The virus is real. It was real. It still is. And so people were responding. And during this time, the economy continued to grow as people took precautions, as big companies took precautions around the world. The people are the marketplace, and the marketplace was reflecting broad optimism. Stock markets were hitting all-time highs as people adjusted to a spreading virus. And then politicians came in and they panicked. And in panicking, they did something. They took away, the marketplace was the people. They took away freedom with predictable results. They said without acting, there would be a crisis, but their actions were the crisis, as you and I well know.
No question. And allow me to share a screen with you and our audience. And of course, there's our New Jersey Constitutional Republicans Facebook group page where we have the announcement of having you today. And here we have a video, John. And of course, Phil Murphy has made countless press conferences regarding the lockdown. And I want you to pay attention. I want the audience to see what the description is, or the motto, if you will, under where Phil Murphy's sitting. It says, "Public health creates economic health." That's public health creates economic health. And John, I would say that your book gives us the contrary view, 100%.
Yes, without question, economic growth is easily the biggest enemy that death and disease have ever known, and poverty is the biggest killer. As you note, it's not an economics book, but I do provide a brief history in chapter 2 just of how primitive medicine used to be. In the 19th century, in rich United States, if you broke your femur, you had 1 in 3 chances of death. But if you lived, your only option was amputation. And let's be clear that amputation back then didn't quite have the painkillers that they have today. If you broke your hip in the 19th century, you were going to die. When you were born in the 19th century, you had as good of a chance of dying as you did living. If you got cancer, forget about it. You were going to die. But see, most people never got to cancer. That would have represented healthcare progress. Pneumonia, which was the captain of man's death, that's what they called it, and tuberculosis killed you first. Even in 1910s, early 20th century, cancer was still a distant eighth among American killers. And the reason for that was that, again, basic viruses were still killing us off fairly readily. And so what changed? Why was World War I the first war in the history of mankind in which more men died from gunshots and bombs than they did from traditional just disease that lived among us? Well, the change was economic growth. Suddenly medical schools, thanks to people like Johns Hopkins, thanks to people like John D. Rockefeller, they became not trade schools meant to basically comfort those who were going to die. They became research institutions as doctors were matched with wealth. That was a creation of economic growth. Suddenly they were coming up with cures for that which used to kill us. And so people were, in a figurative sense, dying once, twice, three times, but living, precisely because economic growth, the fruits of growth matched with doctors and scientists, was elongating life. In 2020, politicians said a threatening virus was spreading, and they quite literally chose economic contraction. Historians will marvel at their abject stupidity.
No question. And as I was reading the book, John, I also, the word politicians, the description of politician, of course, has a very negative connotation to it, and rightfully so. However, we can also think of the politician, especially when it comes to our state legislatures and our federal legislature, as representatives. So they're supposed to be representing us, even though they, of course, are politicians, but they are representatives, and they're there as the founders intended to secure our natural rights. Of course, right within the New Jersey Constitution, it says that the people have the ability to obtain, possess, and protect their property. And the lockdowns were a total abrogation, or a total unconstitutional act for those who had the right to work. And they have the politicians and our representatives have absolutely no respect or regard for the constitutional protections given the people.
Without question, our right to work, our right to live as we want is so basic, yet our right to live as we want was taken from us. Our right to go to a job, particularly if the job was gasp a destination, was taken from us. Your right to operate your business. Politicians were quite literally threatening businesses that remained open with, we will cut off your electricity if you're so daring as to do that. And so you think about, it's not just that they took our freedom, but in taking our freedom, they ignored how very crucial free people are to understanding a virus. And let's never forget, probably many who are watching remember AIDS. The knowledge about AIDS didn't age very well. As I point out in the book, Anthony Fauci wrote a paper in 1983 saying that AIDS was easily transmissible. It could move around within a household. Well, it turned out he was incorrect. That doesn't indict him that he was incorrect. Science is about doubt. It's about learning from projections that are incorrect, assumptions that are incorrect. The difference was Fauci decided that his knowledge in March of 2020 was final, that we must take away your freedom to protect you, which it's not only defied basic constitutional limits on the power of government, but again, let's remember that free people living differently, trying different things are crucial when you're trying to understand a virus. And so I know people, I certainly know libertarians who quite literally didn't go into a restaurant for over a year, who pretty much stayed home. Okay, well, you need people like that. You need to find out if that's a good way of avoiding the virus. My wife, she had just delivered a baby, so she was particularly nervous, and it drove me nuts. When I'd come home, she'd make me wash my hands. When we'd be out walking, if someone walked past us, she'd want to get off the sidewalk. Well, you need people like that. You need to find out if that's effective. You need people like me for whom the trip to the grocery store every day was the highlight of their day. I would purposely forget things at the grocery store so I could go back. You need people like my parents out in Pasadena, California. They're older. They'd grown up with polio and things like that. And they were not in their theoretical final years going to give up their lives. Well, and they're healthy people. And so you need people like that. They went to grocery stores. They continue to socialize with friends. You need people like that to find out what happens to old people. And most of all, the most crucial control group of all that you want to be free are the young people, most likely to throw caution to the wind, to go to bars, parties, make out with girls and guys, all that. They are your most important source of freely produced information, because by rejecting expert opinion, we find out what behavior is most associated with sickness and spread. Instead, politicians not only stole our freedom, but they blinded us to what they claimed was a very threatening virus, yet we couldn't get the information to find out how to deal with it.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And also going back to the state constitution, the very first sentence, John, in our state constitution, Article 1, which is rights and privileges of the citizens, number 1, it says that by nature, people are free and independent. And that consideration wasn't even given a moment's thought by Phil Murphy and the Democrats in power. And our Republicans were caught off guard and surprised, and it was almost as if they thought that they had to do something to show that they were in control and that they were looking out for the benefit of the people. But the best thing would have been to do absolutely nothing, as you make an argument in the chapter of the book.
Oh, without question. And you know, you and I are Republicans, or we swing right, whatever we're going to be. And it speaks to, I expected this from Democrats, but once again, Republicans let me down, because let's be clear about this. The worst arguments made for the lockdowns were the original ones, and Republicans embraced them broadly. The argument was that, well, if we don't take away freedom and the right to work and everything, that people will fill up the hospitals and they're not ready for it. Well, wait, what? Yeah. So if we leave people alone, they're going to engage in behavior associated with hospitalization. Have you ever heard of something more ridiculous, that without politicians leading us around and basically basically jailing us, that we would just go and do something that would cause us to be hospitalized? Where was the Republican reaction saying this is utterly mindless? Which brings us to the even dumber argument. Well, politicians had to take away our freedom because there's this Imperial College study that said 2.3 million Americans would die if they were not locked down. Well, that assumption is logically impossible, and it is not because I'm a doctor. But if suddenly free people living were dying in droves, Americans would have locked down on their own in ways that politicians could never have imagined. At which point, let's assume Imperial College predicts 30 million American deaths. What it tells us is that the more threatening something is presumed to be, the more superfluous is political force, because it needs to be forced to live. We've evolved as a species protecting our ability to live. And so the idea that we were just, oh, well, they didn't lock us down, so let's go commit suicide since they didn't take away our freedom. Again, the initial arguments that Republicans just rolled over on disappoint me more about Republicans than they do about Democrats. We know Democrats want to do this, but why do Republicans, whenever something becomes crisis, why do they always stop acting like Republicans?
That's exactly right. And John, I want to highlight what I think is a very important attribute of your book, and that is the fact that it gives real-time examples of basic economic fundamentals that we talk about, and defines them and how they should be understood in lieu of the infringements of civil liberties as a result of the lockdown, such as the word market. We think of a market as a supermarket or a market where we go to buy goods. However, you make the very clear distinction that markets are made up of people. Peoples represent markets, and free markets are an equivalent to free people, correct?
Absolutely. It's arguably the most important point in the book, so I'm glad you brought it up. that when you take away freedom, you are erasing the marketplace. And
Mhm.
one of the examples I use, as you know, is let's imagine Anthony Fauci at a Washington Nationals baseball game. You know, all politicians want to be all folksy. They love baseball, of course, it's just a given. So imagine him at Nationals Park. It holds 40,000 people. Let's assume for a second, what many won't believe, that he is the smartest individual in that stadium. Okay, maybe it could be true. But let's also be clear that the people in that stadium, their collective knowledge makes Fauci's microscopic by comparison. And so the
Great
point I'm
point.
making there, that I make in the book, is that's what
Yep.
a market is. Why do markets work? They work because they combine the collective knowledge of everyone. It's not that the Soviet Union didn't have experts, it had brilliant people in power. It's not that
Mhm.
Cuba doesn't have experts or North Korea doesn't have experts. They're very smart people, but a few people can never replace the marketplace that is humanity. And so I touched on this earlier. So when politicians said, we have to take away your freedom, we have to induce command and control to protect you, and if we don't, there will be a crisis. They were making a self-fulfilling prophecy, because implicit there is that we're taking away your freedom, which means we're erasing the marketplace, which always results in crisis, and it did again.
Mhm. It's remarkable. And also, John, you talk about a gross domestic policy, or a gross domestic product, rather, in a different way. GDP. Explain what you were talking about, what you talk about in the book with GDP. That was a new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, well, it's just basically it's a worthless number that presumes that a state or a country is an economic island, when in fact, economic activity is a consequence of it's global cooperation and cooperation among people across state lines and everything. And so it's funny the way that they calculate it. Obviously, if government spending, which is a consequence of economic growth, goes up, well, GDP rises. Well, that's a monument to double counting. If they bail out some company and the company starts producing again, that adds to GDP, when we know that by definition is a sign of reduced economic activity. When investment from around the world flows into your country, which is the most bullish signal in the world, that actually brings down GDP. So it's a bad number in that way. But it also forgets what happens when a country like the United States basically takes a break from reality. GDP in El Salvador is very much a consequence of what we do here in the United States. And so when the US basically just shut down and robbed tens of millions of Americans of their jobs, simply remittances from workers in the United States to their relatives in El Salvador, Philippines, India, name your poor country around the world, fell substantially. Suddenly, Salvadorans were putting up white flags on their huts saying that we are starving. That's the signal of what they're talking about when they put a flag up. We have a starving situation here. And so it's not just, when we take a break from reality in the United States, it has incredibly negative implications for the American people, but we're the richest country on earth by far. No other country comes close. What it means for the rest of the world is nothing short of tragic. I mean, the New York Times even admitted that these lockdowns were resulting in 285 million people around the world rushing towards starvation. Hundreds of millions headed back toward poverty. This was easily the worst human rights tragedy of the 21st century. And it was a creation of rich, too cocoon to care politicians and experts who were never going to miss a meal or a paycheck.
No doubt. And also, I thought that in reading the book, I could identify with the references to the famous group Fleetwood Mac. Of course, I grew up in that era. I was more of a new waver Elvis Costello fan at the time, but the story that you tell about the rise and fall, if you will, of Fleetwood Mac, and then you tied it into the ideas of recession. And we have such a negative connotation of the word recession, but recession is a good thing, right?
Recession is merely a sign that people are fixing their mistakes.
Mhm.
The Fleetwood Mac example, as you know, was when during the quote good times for Fleetwood Mac, when they were selling enormous numbers of records and sold out stadiums and arenas, well, they developed cocaine problems. Let's just get it out in the way. And they quite literally
Right.
had, they were sending the private plane that was taking them around the country back to Los Angeles to pick up their cocaine and bringing it back to wherever they were. Well,
Mhm.
this ultimately led to a lot of bad decisions. And so at the end of this tour in 1980, there was no money. And Mick Fleetwood was fired as manager of the band and went out to his backyard in the house in Bel Air that he was forced to sell and cried. That was his recession. But the mistakes that led to the recession happened in the good times. So the recession is what forced Fleetwood Mac to clean up its act, to basically change what it was doing. And in the real world, during good times, it's not unreasonable to say that we develop bad habits. We may
Mhm.
go to work later, we maybe exercise less, maybe we have an extra drink at dinner because it's easier. And so what happens during downturns? We're forced to fail quickly. We're forced to correct what we were doing wrong. And so when politicians fight recessions, they're fighting the natural process whereby an economy gains strength again.
Mhm.
My point in the book was media members and politicians and economists kept saying, oh, well, this is a recession. No, 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 no. It was not a recession. It was the imposition of command and control. Big difference. They took away our freedom and the economy collapsed. That's not a recession. Recessions are healthy. What they did is they took away our rights to work and operate our businesses. Do not insult recession, which is a sign of recovery, with what politicians did in 2020 and beyond.
Yes, and another important economic fundamental that you define in the book, and you really bring it home chapter by chapter, is the idea, the Keynesian idea of consumption. And many of the leftists, or many of those who are economists on the left, believe consumption is everything. But you clearly make the case that it's all about savings, investing, and production. And they like to put the consumption first, but clearly saving money, then investing that money, and then producing as a result of that investment. They are the keys to good economic and healthy markets, correct?
Well, yeah, no question. Consumption's the easy part. Consumption is the consequence of production. We all know this as individuals. The more productive we are at work, the more things we get to buy. But we have to produce first. And it amazes me that someone like Phil Murphy, a former Goldman Sachs partner, and to be clear, Goldman Sachs, what it's done for capitalism over the decades has been nothing short of brilliant. Goldman, what does it do? It constantly moves savings to a higher use. They fund the creation of companies that transform how we work and live. There are no companies and no jobs without investment first, meaning there's no consumption without investment first. And Goldman Sachs is one of the great creators of all this. Yet Phil believes that government spending, basically redistributing the savings of the rich to other people, drives economic growth. No, no, no. Savings are what lead to the creations of Microsofts and Amazons and Intels and all the great pharmaceutical companies in New Jersey and northern New Jersey and throughout. It's the savings that drive economic growth. We all consume. That's easy. And so with the virus spreading, politicians they not only wreck the economy, but then the federal government proceeds to extract 2.9 trillion from that economy to redistribute, get people consuming. Well, that didn't boost the economy. It just robbed us of precious investment capital that we most needed right then, that otherwise would have gone into basically to aid existing businesses as they tried to stay afloat during these needless lockdowns, but also was going toward the creation of new businesses that would transform how we work and live. And so politicians predictably got it backwards. And so they didn't drive an economic rebound. Imagine how much bigger our economy would be today if politicians had done nothing.
Exactly. It reminds me of the very simple strategy that businesses use, the military uses, as far as corrective actions. The government is always performing a corrective action. We could say it's stimulus or quantitative easing. So the one corrective action is a result of another corrective action and another corrective action, and they just keep you keep building and keep escalating these corrective actions, which are all taking money out of the people, out of the people's pocket, and especially the middle class.
Mhm. No, it's no
I
question.
also wanted to,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, John.
No, it's
No,
just,
go ahead.
there's no question that politicians see they're rewarded by the growth of what they're doing. Whereas in the
Mhm.
private sector, businesses are constantly trying to do more with less. In the
Mhm.
government sector, there's an incentive when you fail, at the very least, that is the source of more money. And so
Mhm.
by trying to fix things, as you say, they make a worse problem. That's a given. It's a Republican or a Democrat. But for them,
Mhm.
it creates that, well, we need more money. We need to hire more people. And so the
Mhm.
incentives are all wrong in government, as you and I well know.
That's right. And also, let's talk about what you identify in the book as the clear missing of signals. Now, what's amazing is that the politicians ignored the market signals. And of course, the Fed doesn't ignore market signals when they're devising policy or they're talking about raising or lowering interest rates. They're very, very cognitive of what happens in the markets. And the markets were showing us that there wasn't going to be this catastrophe that was promoted and propagated. Is that
Yeah.
true?
Oh, of course it was. Let's never forget that markets don't just tell the truth, but they give you a snapshot of the future. And so again, the virus has been spreading for months, beginning in China. And so we knew from China that the virus was many things, none of them terribly lethal. And people will say, but the Chinese cover things up. You cannot cover up a virus, particularly if it's a killer, and here's why. People can love or hate China. I know people have different views on it. But what no one watching can deny is that the Chinese consumer is a major, major customer of US companies. Apple sells a fifth of its iPhones in China. Amazon is a major, major customer of China. There are 4,100 Starbucks in China on the way to 7,000, on the way to tens of thousands. There are 3,700 McDonald's in China. GM sells more cars in China than it does in North America. It's the second largest market for Nike. And so this is important because if the Chinese had been getting sick and dying en masse, this would have reflected in collapsing US equity prices long before March of 2020 to reflect the loss of a very major market. In fact, the second largest market for the biggest US companies. US shares were hitting all-time highs as the virus was spreading throughout China. There's no way they could have hidden this. And so the market signals were telling us that they weren't denying that this was real. Goodness, the companies over there, and US companies have a major presence over there, they well knew about it. And they were testing their employees. FedEx has a 907 employee operation in Wuhan. They tested all their employees. But what they found is their employees were in good shape, younger people and everything. And so they knew about this. The markets were pricing all this information in, yet politicians still locked down, even though every signal from China was that it's real, but it's not a major killer.
It's hard to believe that they didn't see all this and they didn't take, like you said, Fred Smith, the owner of FedEx over there with all those employees, and there wasn't any fatalities as a result of that. And they're right there in the heart. And there are many people, John, as you well know, that really bought the idea of a cover up, that the Chinese were covering this up. And of course, it was propagated by our president at the time. So there's no question that they were looking for scapegoats. That's for sure. John, I wanted to read a portion that you have in the book. I thought it was very interesting, and everybody can relate to this comment made by Illinois State Senator Dan McConchie. And as you write, perhaps vivified the stupidity most effectively in an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal, as he put it about Governor Jay Pritzker's executive order. And this is what he said, and this is something we can all identify with, and we're all still asking the question, John, and that is, quote, I can visit Target to buy furniture, Walmart to buy clothing, or my grocery store to buy flowers. But I can't go inside a furniture store, a clothing store, or a florist, even though those stores could easily adopt the same safety measures required of the retail outlets permitted to stay open. And it is truly remarkable, the contradiction there that is so adequately explained by the state senator from Illinois.
Absolutely. He put it so well. And you think about its meaning on so many levels. For one, the presumption from the political class and experts was that the very humans who'd driven all progress, including healthcare progress, were suddenly a lethal menace to one another, that if we actually got around each other, we were going to kill each other, which just insulted reason on its own. When you think about this, their viewpoint, which was absurd, that we needed to be separated from one another. Okay, but based on that, you are going to limit the number of businesses that we can go into. That seems like that works at cross purposes with your ridiculous theory in the first place. Furthermore, it blinded us once again. Let's be clear, Disney probably would have locked down its parks at first to begin with, just because it's a large company with good access to capital markets. And so it might have taken that risk because, well, we don't want the brand risk of, lots of people spreading the virus at Disney World. Okay, well, fair enough. But that's precisely why you want to leave businesses free to make different decisions, because a lot of small businesses wouldn't have been able to make that kind of choice. That's the luxury of very few businesses. And so small businesses would have done as McConchie alluded. They would have come up with all different ways to meet the needs of a fearful customer base. And in coming up with ways to meet the needs of a fearful customer base, they were going to provide crucial information to the large businesses about how to reopen. What do customers want? What scares them? What doesn't scare them? What is the best way to go about this? And so when the economy needed crucial information, once again, politicians blinded the players in the economy to what they needed to know in order to get back to producing.
We did a couple of videos too, John. One of them was talking about the unprecedented deprivation of constitutional rights for the first time in our nation through Revolutionary War. And of course, we had a smallpox epidemic during that. And I believe we lost more of our Continental Army to smallpox than we did the bullets from the British oppressors that we were fighting at the time. And then we had 1812, and we had cholera outbreaks in the mid 18th or 19th century. We had a tremendous, horribly bloody Civil War. We had World War I. We had various, we had the Spanish flu. We had the AIDS epidemic in New York and all this, but we never suspended the constitutional rights of the freedom of assembly, First Amendment rights, and also the freedom of religious expression. The first time in our history we suspended these constitutional rights, and the people are almost ambiguous or oblivious to this reality, as well as the politicians they elect to represent them. It's unprecedented.
It is, and it speaks to something that I'm still working out in my head. I love progress in all ways, and I wouldn't give it up in any way. But as I point out in the book, there's quite simply no way the lockdowns would have happened in 2020 if the virus starts spreading then, or in 2000 if the virus starts spreading then. Because think about it. Well, Mark Zuckerberg was in high school then, so there's no Facebook on which for people to basically communicate with one another, but also show all their virtuous ways of dealing with the virus. There's no Netflix. See, at the time, Netflix existed, but it was a desperately sad company trying to sell itself to Blockbuster. And so there was no Netflix to stream videos on and watch Tiger King over and over again back then. You may remember, I remember well because I was at Goldman Sachs around 2000. They took Webvan public. It was the first online grocery delivery company. It failed. So there were no subhumans, you know, those people who actually have to go to work to deliver groceries to rich people sitting at home. And there was certainly, internet wasn't near fast enough because it was very dial-up at the time. So there's no Postmates or Grubhub or Uber Eats, you know, for those other subhumans to drop food off on people's doorsteps. Please don't knock on the door. Do not touch anything. We can't. You've got cooties, you people that are out in the world who don't believe in science.
Yeah.
So none of the ways in which the well-to-do were able to deal with the lockdowns fairly comfortably existed 20 years ago. And so again, technology is amazing. I want progress in all ways, but it's worth pointing out, and I do in the book, that without these technological advances, it's probably very hard for government to take away our liberty in the way they did. Nowadays, because of these advances, all too many of us can live very comfortably for quite some time, as we found out.
And John, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea. Of course, the founders structured the Constitution so there would be checks and balances. Of course, I'm still looking in the Constitution. I'm still looking in our state constitution for the words executive orders. I still can't find them. And the idea was that there would be an offset, there would be checks and balances, responsibility, separation of powers, which is really what is the structure of the Constitution, as Madison, the founders, intended. And then along comes men, progressives like Woodrow Wilson and specifically Frank Goodenow, who talked about politics and administration, which would eliminate the need for a separation of powers, and that there would be a political agenda that would be agreed upon and pushed, and then an administrative agency would accomplish that. And isn't that really what's happened with the lockdowns? Can we look back to those ideas of Frank Goodenow and the ideas of politics and administration and see their proliferation with the whole lockdown and with the infringement upon civil liberties? How do you think
without question? You can't. I always tie it to the 1930s. It was in the 1930s that Republicans and Democrats in Washington decided they were going to fight a recession in predictable fashion. In fighting what was healthy, they elongated what by global standards was still an economic boom, but by US standards was a slowdown. And so we're seeing it again. I'm so glad you brought this up, because if government lives within its constitutional swim lanes of states' rights, this happened. To which some people will say, well, wait a second, states' rights were everywhere. Florida locked down on April 1st, New York locked down, I think, on March 16th, New Jersey around the same time. States try different things. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But wait a second. Imagine if Donald Trump acts like Donald Trump, obstreperous Donald Trump, and says, whatever you think about this virus, in his view at the time, like Anna Wintour of Vogue, and so this was a left and right view, was that, oh, it's no big deal. But whatever you governors think, any governor so foolish as to take away freedom and to lock down as response to this is going to have me, Donald Trump, to deal with, because I can't think of a more ridiculous thing than to crush an economy as a virus mitigation strategy. So that would have been Donald Trump acting like Donald Trump. Okay, I'm going to visit all your states daily if you do something so ridiculous. Well, so imagine if he does this. For one, he gives all sorts of Republican governors the cover to not do what made no sense, as in take away freedom. Let's be clear, Florida locked down. So did Texas. They just did later. Also, the world relies on the United States. And so if the US doesn't lock down, probably a lot of countries around the world say, okay, well, if they're not doing it, we're not going to do it. And so that on its own, but let's throw in, it's not just that Trump didn't do that, but he went and signed a $2.9 trillion, quote, stimulus bill that very much erased states' rights. Let's think about it. Does anyone think California, New York, and New Jersey could have locked down for more than a week absent a federal response with money?
Mhm.
The question answers itself. And so, no, the federal government did what it was not constitutionally. I mean, arguably, I think even libertarians would agree with me because they made the point that states have police power. Okay, well, by that measure, the federal government had no role in this. And so if the federal government does nothing, California's got to reopen very quickly. New Jersey can't lock down, and if it does, it's very brief. New York. And so the federal response, what I would say is an unconstitutional federal response, set the stage for lockdowns. It subsidized lockdowns that could never have happened had the federal government done nothing.
It's a great point, John. And I think the challenge that we lovers of liberty, like yourself and like the constitutional Republicans, I think we have our real challenge is the people who supported these lockdowns, the citizens who gave up these rights. And that's where the politics come in, the will of the people, the majority of the will of the people who say, we want the government to protect us. So this is what you have to do. You have to lock down. And this is very dangerous. And this is why it's so important for people to be reading what you're putting out on a daily basis and read this book that you've written, and to follow the constitutional Republicans as we talk about restoring the initial structure of the Constitution, because we believe the Constitution is what protects our rights, not politicians. And we have to view politicians on their ability to represent us justly in relation to their enumerated constitutional responsibilities, and stay, as you say, within those lanes of constitutional duties. But I think the real challenge, John, is that we have to convince the people this was not a good thing. And as you say in the book, it can't happen again. And we have to use the statistical evidence that supports our position that the lockdowns did far greater damage than if we didn't lock down.
Well, I agree with everything you say, but the one correction I would have on that is I think it's very dangerous to make a statistical argument. You notice my second to last chapter says if we make this a numeric argument, we lose. And the reason for that is that it implies that there's some level of death or sickness that gives politicians the right to take away our freedom. And I really can't stress enough that I think our side has been too focused on, well, the CDC says 90% of those who have the virus had some other comorbidity. And, you know, the New York Times was very honest about the virus within articles that appeared alarmist on the front page, saying that, you know, the vast majority of those who died with the virus were associated with nursing homes and things like that. Old people. Okay, it doesn't minimize old people, but the point was they were making the implicit point that people were dying with the virus, not necessarily of it. Okay. And so the statistics support a lack of alarmism. But wait a second. The more threatening something is, the less of the need for government response in the first place. Americans were already quarantining. They're already locking down on their own. In parts of the country that weren't locked down, restaurants were less visited. People were out in public less. And this is so crucial. People don't need a law. They don't need to be forced to protect themselves from sickness and death. And so what I cannot stress enough is that never again, you never take away the freedom of the people. It's wrong morally. It's wrong economically, and economic growth is the biggest enemy of death and disease. But also it's wrong simply because when you take away the freedom of the people, you are arresting the marketplace and you are going to create a crisis. Just don't do it. Statistics, no. We'll win arguments, but we'll lose the war. This has got to be about, as you've alluded constantly throughout this, and the New Jersey Constitution makes clear, as individuals, as people, we just have natural rights. End of story.
That's right. That's right. And just let me clarify too, John, when I'm talking about statistics, I'm saying that we have to research and do real hard homework, as you've done with the book, but we just can't take the CDC's word for it, or we can't take the New Jersey Department of Health as word for it. We have to actually really do a hard digging and hard work in getting accurate statistics, not just statistics. Because we can identify data based on the bias of the person who's looking at the data, which happens all too often in this polarized political environment that we're in the nation now. But I think it's important that we actually really, because the science is by no means conclusive right now, especially now that we go into the vaccine situation with requiring mandated vaccines. And there are a lot of people out there like myself who don't want to get the vaccine. I'm not sure about what the long range effects of the vaccine are. I don't believe there's enough data. There's not enough statistical data telling me that this is a good thing as opposed to a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is so important. And I argue this in the book, and you've just made the same point, that knowledge rarely ages well. We just don't know. Look at the victory laps taken by our side. Well, Florida didn't lock down last, and it's got a lower death rate among old people than New York does. And New York locked down first, but look at what happened in the nursing homes. No. That's missing the point. Knowledge doesn't age well. The biggest tragedy of New York was just the taking of freedom, because it disallowed the trying of different things. And so if you don't take away freedom, probably a lot of those old people, they were very old and probably sick people. One guesses that they didn't have a lot of time left either way, but probably they try different things as the virus is spreading. That's all you want. The idea that the state can plan a good outcome versus sickness misses the point. So when our side says, well, we lock down less, the red states lock down less. No. The genius of the red states locking down less is that people were just free to try different things. That's end of story. Just leave it right there. Freedom works. Don't make it about statistics, because once you do that, there's always going to be a statistic that disproves your argument. And the point is, freedom is the only answer. Anything else presumes a role for government as a virus is spreading. And as we've learned, hopefully in ways that we will never forget, when government responds to a crisis, government becomes the crisis.
No question. And John, as we wind down, I have a question for you, a little bit of an aside, but I'd like to ask you a question. Being a historian of the Whigs, and of course the Whigs made up primarily Abraham Lincoln was an early Whig, and one of probably the most predominant policy of the 19th century was tariffs. Now, do you think that there's ever been a time in American history where tariffs were actually a good policy? What are your thoughts on that? Because I know what your thoughts on tariff. Never.
Tariffs are a tax on work. We work and get things. If you're a worker, you're an importer. It could be from across the street or the other side of the world. And so anything that limits your ability to get on its own, it's a tax on your work, which is shameful and immoral. But it goes beyond that. Let's never forget that the greatest genius of free trade, and just regardless of what other countries want to injure their people, they can do that, but we just shouldn't as Americans do that. The greatest genius of open markets is that it makes it most likely that you get to do the work most associated with your skill set. The more you can divide up work, the more productive you are, because you can specialize. Adam Smith, that was the initial stuff in the great book, Wealth of Nations. It's good. Every page is good in it. And he talks about how one person working alone could maybe make 1 pin a day, but 10 people working together, specializing, could make 48,000 pins a day. And so the genius of letting the world produce for you is you have the greatest odds of, basically in a school sense, avoiding the calculus classes that you hate, so that you can focus on PE and literature. You can focus on what you do best. And so there's never a good reason, I don't think, for it.
Right. And I have to tell you, John, that you've been a major influence on me changing my mind over to a free trader. The only thing that I will always remember or take into consideration with the tariffs, that they were initially they're designed to protect American manufacturing. However, you make the case, as well as the Austrian schools always made the case, that through ingenuity, through competition, great things come about, great products are made, and the world should be opened up to receive and to send these great products and these great interventions throughout the world. It shouldn't just be an isolated and protectionist theory. So I definitely agree with you.
Yeah, anything that protects the present robs us of the future. Let's never forget the parts of the United States that are most economically vibrant are ones that leave the past behind with great regularity. Let's not forget that in the 1930s, New York City was the biggest manufacturing locale in the nation. Los Angeles was number 4. In between that was Flint and Milwaukee. Well, Flint and Milwaukee clung to the past. How did that work out? Los Angeles and New York didn't. How did it work out? They're the two of the richest cities in the world. Flint and Milwaukee are kind of a black past. Anything that protects the present is incredibly economically damaging. That which engages us with the rest of the world, always the most liberal country in the sense of being open to foreign produce is always the richest country.
And I certainly agree. And I just want to share with the people, I wanted to show them your website here called realclearmarkets.com. You're going to want to go to this page. You're going to make it a favorite. John put out an article yesterday, Vaccines, Mandates, and the Predictable Folly of Central Planning, an excellent article. And also another one that I thought we talked about, and he also talked about in the book on the 26th, Ignore the Monday Morning Hype. No government could cover up a virus. Of course, a lot of us believe that the Chinese were indeed doing that. John makes the strong case that that was not so, but you're going to want to go to John's Real Clear Markets website to get join that site. And you're going to definitely reap a lot of good journalism. As I said, I believe John to be the finest journalist when it comes to free markets and discussing economic issues. And then, of course, you're going to want to go on Amazon and get this book, When Politicians Panicked. And there it is. It's When Politicians Panicked, the new coronavirus expert opinion and a tragic lapse of reason. And it came out on March 30th, but you're going to get it for right now, John. It's at $20.99, which I say you could easily charge double that. But right now it's a steal for the people to go on Amazon and order this book by John Tamny, When Politicians Panicked, the new coronavirus expert opinion and a tragic lapse of reason. So there you have it. You're going to want to get that book and follow John on his website. John, I want to thank you so much for the time you've taken today. I hope to have you on again so that you can set us straight economically and with the markets. And thank you so much for joining me.
JR, thank you so much for having me on. It's a treat and it's a privilege anytime to be asked about a book that you've written, but you obviously read the book closely, which just means so much to me. So thank you. What a great interview. What great questions. I really appreciate you taking the time to interview me and feature me. And anytime you'll have me back, I'm glad to join you.
We'll definitely do it again. And I really encourage our audience to get this book. It's a great read. You won't want to put it down. And John, of course, being a historian, he uses a lot of historical examples. And like I said, he's bringing out a lot of basic economic principles and ideas in the book, but you're going to want to get it. And John, as I leave you, I want to talk about what we always say, where I always end our programs. We talk about Lincoln was talking about the idea behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That he said it was something, and I'm paraphrasing, there's something about the human heart. And that is the idea of liberty to all. And that gives us, by consequence, the ability to invent and to work and to create for our lives our own being. So with that said, liberty to all. I thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see you all again. Please like and share the video so that more people can hear about John and his book. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Hey, thanks, JR. I really appreciate it.
We'll do it again.
Yes, please. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.